They treated me like I was invisible, like the trash I emptied from their pristine offices every night, until the moment I pressed record on my phone and captured them casually discussing how to launder $3 million through their charity foundation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Marcus, and for 18 months I'd been the night cleaner at Meridian Financial Group, one of those glass tower investment firms where men in $1,000 suits moved other people's money around and called it work. I'd taken the job after my construction company went under, swallowing my pride along with the reality that at 52, starting over meant starting at the bottom. The building was 40 stories of marble and mahogany, all clean lines and corporate power. I worked the 38th floor, where the senior partners kept their offices. Every night at 11 p.m., I'd badge in through the service entrance, take the freight elevator up, and spend the next 6 hours making their world spotless for the morning. They never acknowledged me, not once. I'd push my cart past their late-night meetings, emptying wastebaskets while they huddled around conference tables, their voices dropping to whispers when I entered. I was furniture to them, a necessary inconvenience like the security cameras or the fire extinguishers, something that existed but didn't matter. Richard Hawthorne was the worst. Senior partner, corner office, that particular brand of arrogance that came from inheriting wealth and mistaking it for intelligence. He'd leave his office like a tornado had hit it, coffee cups abandoned on every surface, papers scattered across his desk, takeout containers that stank up the whole floor. But it was the way he looked through me that cut deepest, not with contempt, which would have at least acknowledged my humanity, with nothing, like I simply wasn't there. His assistant, Jennifer Chen, was different. She stayed late most nights, and when our paths crossed, she'd offer a tired smile, a slight nod. Professional courtesy, nothing more. But in that building, it felt like kindness. She was maybe 30, sharp as a blade, and clearly did most of Hawthorne's actual work while he took the credit. Then there was Marcus Webb, same first name as mine, which led to the occasional misdirected email that gave me glimpses into their world. He was Hawthorne's business partner, younger but just as ruthless, with the kind of dead eyes that suggested he'd never met a line he wouldn't cross if the price was right. For 18 months, I absorbed their casual cruelty like background radiation. Hawthorne leaving increasingly hostile notes about my work, the trash not emptied to his satisfaction, the desk arranged incorrectly, coffee stains on surfaces I'd never touched. Building management started calling me in for meetings, their tone suggesting I was lucky to have a job at all. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I'd arrived at my usual time, badged in, taken the service elevator up. The floor was unusually active for 11 p.m., multiple offices still lit, voices carrying down the hallway. I started my routine, working my way toward Hawthorne's corner office, when I heard the commotion. His voice carried through his door, sharp with the kind of anger that came from embarrassment. Something about missing documents, a presentation that had fallen apart, clients who were threatening to walk. I couldn't make out the details, but the fury was unmistakable. I knocked, waited for the response that never came, then used my key. Hawthorne was alone, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair disheveled. His desk was even more chaotic than usual. Papers everywhere, his laptop open to what looked like financial statements, empty whiskey bottles in the trash. He looked up when I entered, and for the first time in 18 months, he actually saw me. His face went through a progression of emotions, surprise, embarrassment, then something much darker. I started to back out, to give him privacy, but he was already standing, moving around his desk with predatory purpose. His face was flushed, his eyes slightly unfocused, and I could smell the alcohol from across the room. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the slight tremor in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, infinitely more dangerous than shouting would have been. He informed me that I was fired, effective immediately. Security would escort me out, and I wasn't to return to the building under any circumstances. No notice, no severance, no explanation beyond his assertion that my work had been unsatisfactory. I stood there, cleaning supplies in hand, and felt something cold settle in my chest. 18 months of swallowed pride, of being invisible, of watching these people treat the world like their personal playground. All of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. I nodded once, set down my supplies, and walked out. But I didn't go to security. Instead, I went to the break room, the one place on the floor where cameras couldn't see me, and sat in the dark. Hawthorne's office was directly above, And the building's ventilation system carried sound in interesting ways if you knew where to listen. That's when I learned about the Meridian Foundation. Voices drifted down through the air vents, Hawthorne and Webb, their conversations sharp with urgency. They were discussing the charity foundation their firm had established, ostensibly to provide financial literacy education to underserved communities. Noble cause, great for their public image, perfect tax write-off. It was also a money laundering operation. They'd been moving funds through the foundation for months, taking dirty money from clients whose names I recognized from FBI wanted posters, cleaning it through fake educational programs and inflated administrative costs, then cycling it back out as legitimate charitable contributions to shell companies they controlled. $3 million. That's what Webb mentioned. $3 million in the current cycle, with more coming once they'd refined the process. I sat in that dark break room, listening to them plan their crimes, and felt something shift inside me. They'd fired me for being inconvenient, for seeing too much of their world, for existing in their space when they were vulnerable. They'd made me invisible for 18 months, then cast me out the moment that invisibility became uncomfortable. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. I waited until their voices faded, until the floor went quiet, then made my way to the security office. The night guard, Tommy, was someone I'd built a rapport with over the months. A former Marine who understood what it meant to be overlooked by people who'd never earned their privilege. I told him I'd been let go, that I was just collecting my things. He looked genuinely sorry, mentioned that he'd always thought I did good work. When he asked if I needed him to call me a cab, I told him I'd already arranged a ride. What I actually did was badge out, walk 3 blocks to an all-night diner, and start planning. The next morning, I called the building management company and requested my personnel file, claiming I needed it for unemployment benefits. The woman in HR was sympathetic. Apparently, she'd gotten a scathing email from Hawthorne about my termination, full of accusations that anyone who'd actually supervised my work would know were false. She mentioned almost offhandedly that several other tenants had complained about Hawthorne's treatment of service staff. Nothing actionable, just pattern of behavior that made everyone uncomfortable. She also mentioned that the building's security footage was kept for 90 days before being automatically archived. Useful information for someone planning ahead. I spent the next week doing research. Meridian Financial Group had been in business for 8 years, built their reputation on serving high-net-worth clients who valued discretion. Their client list was private, naturally, but their marketing materials mentioned several names that had appeared in recent money laundering investigations. The Meridian Foundation was more interesting. Established 2 years ago, it claimed to have distributed over $10 million in educational grants. But when I looked up the recipient organizations, half of them had addresses that led to empty offices or mail drops. The other half existed, but had no record of receiving any funding from Meridian. It was elegant, really. They'd created an entire ecosystem of fake charities and phantom programs, all designed to make dirty money look clean. The only flaw in their system was operational security. They'd gotten careless, discussing details in places where someone might overhear. Someone invisible. Someone they'd never consider a threat. I started visiting the building during my old shift, but now as a visitor rather than an employee. The new cleaner was a young kid named Diego who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the job. I befriended him at the diner across the street, mentioned that I used to work his route, offered tips on which offices required special attention. Within a week, I was occasionally helping him out. Nothing official, just showing him the ropes. Security knew me. Management was used to seeing me, and nobody questioned why the former night cleaner might still be around, training his replacement. It gave me access. More importantly, it gave me invisibility again, but this time I controlled it. I learned their schedules, their patterns, their habits. Hawthorne worked late 3 nights a week, usually alone after 8 p.m. Webb preferred early morning meetings, arriving by 6 a.m. when the building was still quiet. Jennifer Chen was there most evenings until at least 10, managing the fires that both men constantly started. I also learned about their security protocols. The 38th floor had camera coverage in the hallways and common areas, but the individual offices were considered private space. Their computers locked automatically after 10 minutes of inactivity, but only Hawthorne bothered with additional encryption, and his password was his daughter's name, plus the year he'd founded the company. Information I'd gleaned from the family photos on his desk and the commemorative plaque on his wall. Most importantly, I learned about their upcoming audit. The IRS was conducting a routine examination of the Meridian Foundation's activities, scheduled for the end of the month. Nothing suspicious, just standard due diligence for a charitable organization that had grown quickly and claimed significant expenses. Hawthorne and Webb had been preparing for weeks, creating documentation to support their fictional programs, rehearsing explanations for transactions that would look questionable to outside scrutiny. They were confident they could weather the audit. Their documentation was thorough, their story consistent, their lawyers expensive. What they didn't know was that I'd been documenting their activities too, and my records told a very different story. Every night for 2 weeks, I collected evidence. Not just the conversations I overheard, but physical proof of their operation. Discarded drafts of emails that revealed the real purpose of foundation transfers, financial statements that showed the true destination of charitable funds, meeting notes that outlined which clients were being served by their laundering operation. They threw everything away, confident that their trash would disappear into the building's waste management system. They never considered that someone might be interested enough to retrieve it, to piece together their discarded secrets into a comprehensive picture of their crimes. But it wasn't enough. Trash could be dismissed as fabricated, conversations could be denied, financial records could be explained away by expensive lawyers. I needed something undeniable, something that would implicate them in their own words, captured in a way that couldn't be disputed. I needed them on record. The opportunity came during their final preparation meeting, the Thursday before the audit. I'd learned they would be working late, reviewing their story one last time, making sure every detail was consistent. Webb's assistant had booked a conference room for 8 p.m., then canceled it when they decided Hawthorne's office would be more private. Private. Perfect. I arrived early, helped Diego with his rounds, then found an excuse to linger on the 38th floor. The air conditioning system in older buildings like this one created interesting acoustic properties. Sound carried through ducts and vents in ways that the original architects never intended. The break room where I'd first overheard their conversation shared a ventilation system with Hawthorne's office. But there was an even better listening post in the supply closet next to his private bathroom. I discovered it weeks earlier, a maintenance access point where building engineers could service the HVAC system. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and had a direct line to every word spoken in Hawthorne's office. It was also completely invisible to security cameras and building surveillance. At 7:45 p.m., I slipped into the closet with my phone, set to record, and waited. They arrived exactly on time. Hawthorne and Webb, their voices tense with pre-audit anxiety. For the first hour, they reviewed their prepared statements, rehearsing responses to potential questions, refining the details of their cover story. It was all perfectly legal, the kind of preparation any organization might do before regulatory scrutiny. Then Webb mentioned the Patterson account. James Patterson was a defense contractor who'd been indicted for bribery, but fled the country before trial. The FBI had frozen his domestic assets, but rumors suggested he'd moved millions overseas before disappearing. Webb had been handling his account, helping him access those frozen funds through a series of transactions that looked like legitimate business expenses. The Meridian Foundation had been the vehicle. Patterson's money came in as a large charitable donation, was cycled through their fake programs as administrative expenses and educational grants, then emerged as clean funds transferred to accounts he could access from his exile in a non-extradition country. $2.7 million. That's what Webb had moved for Patterson over the last 6 months, taking a 30% commission for the service. It was their most profitable client relationship, and they were hoping to expand the operation to serve similar fugitives. Hawthorne was enthusiastic about the possibilities. He mentioned 2 other potential clients: a pharmaceutical executive wanted for Medicare fraud, and a tech entrepreneur who'd embezzled pension funds. Both had reached out through intermediaries. Both had substantial sums that needed laundering. Both were willing to pay premium rates for the service. They spent another hour discussing operational details, how to structure the transactions to avoid triggering reporting requirements, which fake charities could handle larger volumes without attracting attention, how to create documentation that would satisfy auditors without creating evidence that could be used against them. It was perfect. Detailed confessions to multiple felonies, captured in their own voices, completely unaware they were being recorded. But I didn't move, didn't celebrate, didn't even breathe deeply, because they weren't finished. Webb brought up the cleaner situation, meaning me. He was concerned that my sudden termination might attract attention, especially if I filed for unemployment or applied for jobs that required reference checks. He suggested they create documentation to justify the firing, Maybe claim I'd been stealing supplies or accessing areas I wasn't authorized to enter. Hawthorne laughed, a cold sound that carried clearly through the ventilation system. He said I was nobody, a disposable worker who couldn't cause them problems even if I wanted to. Who would believe anything I said? Who would even listen? I was invisible to people who mattered, just like all the other service workers who cleaned their building and emptied their trash. That's when he mentioned the security footage. Building policy required all terminations to be documented with video evidence, particularly if there were allegations of misconduct. Hawthorne had requested the footage from my last night, planning to edit it to show me entering offices I wasn't supposed to access, handling documents I shouldn't touch, creating the foundation for a theft accusation if I ever became inconvenient. He had the footage on his laptop, ready to be edited and submitted to building management. Insurance against a problem that would never materialize, because people like me didn't fight back against people like them. People like me knew our place. I sat in that closet, listening to them plan my character assassination, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. They hadn't just fired me. They'd prepared to destroy my reputation, to ensure I couldn't find work anywhere else, to make me unemployable in an industry where background checks were standard procedure. They'd made me invisible, then tried to erase me entirely. But they'd also given me everything I needed to destroy them. The meeting ended just after 10 p.m. I waited in the closet until the floor went quiet, then slipped out and made my way to the service elevator. My phone held 2 hours of recorded conversation, featuring detailed confessions to money laundering, tax fraud, and conspiracy charges that would put both men in federal prison for decades. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to have their lives destroyed by someone they'd considered insignificant. I wanted them to know exactly who had brought them down and why. I wanted them to see me. The next morning, I made copies of the recording, multiple backups stored in different locations, uploaded to cloud services, burned to physical media. Then I began transcribing every word, creating a written record with timestamps and detailed annotations. The conversation was damning enough on its own, but I wanted to make sure investigators would understand every implication, every criminal act discussed in their casual business jargon. While I worked, I planned the next phase. Simply turning the evidence over to law enforcement would be satisfying, but it would also be anonymous. They'd be arrested, charged, probably convicted, but they might never know how their perfect operation had been exposed. They'd assume it was bad luck, poor operational security, one of the risks of doing business in the gray areas of finance. I wanted them to know it was personal. That weekend, I visited the offices of 3 different newspapers, local, regional, and national publications that covered financial crime. I didn't make appointments, didn't call ahead, just showed up at their newsrooms with copies of my evidence and asked to speak with investigative reporters. The first 2 were polite but dismissive. My story sounded too convenient, too perfectly incriminating. Why would senior partners at a respected financial firm discuss criminal activity so openly? How had a night cleaner managed to record private conversations? Was I a disgruntled employee trying to get revenge for an unfair termination? The third reporter was different. Sarah Martinez at the Regional Business Journal had been covering financial fraud for over a decade, and she recognized authentic evidence when she heard it. She listened to portions of the recording, examined my transcripts, asked pointed questions about how I'd obtained the information. When I explained about being fired, about overhearing their conversations through the building's ventilation system, about their plan to fabricate evidence of theft to justify my termination, her expression shifted from skepticism to professional interest. She wanted exclusive access to the story in exchange for protecting my identity until I was ready to go public. I agreed, but with conditions. The story wouldn't run until I'd completed my own preparations. When it did run, it would include my name and my account of how I'd gathered the evidence. I wasn't hiding anymore. Martinez began her own investigation, using my evidence as a starting point to uncover additional details about the Meridian Foundation's operations. She traced the fake charities, interviewed people who were supposed to have benefited from their programs, documented the paper trail that proved the foundation was a criminal enterprise. While she worked, I prepared for the confrontation. I knew they would realize something was wrong when the audit began. The IRS investigators I'd contacted through an anonymous tip would arrive with questions their prepared statements couldn't answer, would demand documentation that didn't exist, would quickly realize they were looking at a systematic fraud operation rather than simple compliance issues. Hawthorne and Webb would panic. They'd try to contact their clients, warn them that the operation had been compromised, maybe attempt to destroy evidence or transfer remaining funds out of the foundation's accounts. They'd make mistakes, leave digital footprints, create additional evidence of their guilt. But before any of that happened, I wanted them to understand what they'd brought on themselves. The audit was scheduled for Tuesday morning. On Monday evening, I arrived at the building for what would be my final visit. Diego was working his shift, and he seemed grateful for the help. The 38th floor was a challenging route, and he was still learning the particular demands of each office. I helped him with the common areas, the conference rooms, the executive bathrooms. But when we reached Hawthorne's office, I asked him to let me handle it alone. I told him the senior partner was particular about his space, that I'd dealt with him before and knew his preferences. Diego was happy to let someone else deal with a difficult client. Hawthorne was working late, as expected. I could see light under his door, hear the soft sounds of typing, the occasional rustle of papers. I knocked, waited for the response that never came, then used the key Diego had given me. He looked up when I entered, and his face went through the same progression of emotions I'd seen the night he fired me. Surprise, recognition, then something much darker. I set down my cleaning supplies and pulled out my phone. Not to record this time, but to play back portions of his conversation with Webb from the previous Thursday. His own voice discussing money laundering operations, planning character assassination, dismissing me as nobody who mattered. His face went white as he recognized his own words, understood what he was hearing. I let the recording play for 30 seconds, then stopped it and put the phone back in my pocket. I explained in a calm and conversational tone exactly what I'd done with his confession. The copies I'd made, the reporters I'd contacted, the federal investigators who would be arriving in the morning with questions he couldn't answer. I told him about the IRS agents who were already reviewing the Meridian Foundation's records, about the forensic accountants who were tracing every transaction his fake charities had processed. I informed him that his money laundering operation was finished, that his business was about to collapse, that he and Webb would be spending the next decade explaining their actions to federal prosecutors. Then I told him the part that would hurt the most. I'd been invisible to him for 18 months, but I'd seen everything. Every late-night meeting, every casual discussion of criminal activities, every arrogant assumption that service workers were too stupid or too powerless to matter. I'd watched him treat Jennifer Chen like a personal secretary while she did the actual work that kept his business running. I'd seen him humiliate junior employees, berate support staff, treat everyone around him like they existed solely for his convenience. I'd seen who he really was when he thought nobody was watching, and now everyone else would see it too. The recording I'd made included more than just their money laundering discussion. It captured Hawthorne's casual racism when he talked about clients, his sexual harassment of female employees, his contempt for anyone he considered beneath his social status. All of it would be part of the public record when the investigation became public. All of it would be evidence of the kind of person who thought he could buy his way out of any consequences. I picked up my cleaning supplies and headed for the door. Before leaving, I turned back and looked at him. Really looked, the way he'd never looked at me. He was sitting behind his expensive desk in his expensive suit, but he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the knowledge that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. I told him he'd been right about one thing. People like me did know our place, but he'd made a mistake thinking our place was beneath him. Some of us were just waiting for the right moment to rise. The next morning, Sarah Martinez's story broke simultaneously with the IRS raid on Meridian Financial Group's offices. Federal agents arrived with search warrants and began seizing computers, financial records, and communications equipment, while reporters gathered outside the building's glass entrance. The story had everything: money laundering for fugitive criminals, a fake charity that stole millions intended for education programs, two respected financial professionals who'd built their success on systematic fraud. But the angle that captured public attention was how they'd been exposed. By an invisible cleaner they'd dismissed as insignificant, who'd recorded their criminal confessions while hiding in a supply closet. The recordings went viral within hours. Social media exploded with commentary about economic inequality, workplace dignity, and the arrogance of privileged criminals who thought service workers were too stupid to understand their crimes. Invisible No More became a trending hashtag shared by thousands of people who'd experienced similar workplace humiliation. Hawthorne and Webb were arrested at their homes that afternoon, charged with money laundering, tax fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Their lawyers immediately began damage control, claiming the charges were based on illegally obtained evidence. But the recordings were clear and unambiguous. Neither man's voice could be disputed. Neither man's words could be explained away. Jennifer Chen became the government's star witness. Faced with potential charges for her peripheral involvement in the operation, she cooperated fully with investigators, providing additional documentation and testimony that filled in the gaps in my recorded evidence. She'd known something was wrong, but had been afraid to speak up, afraid of losing her job, afraid of being dismissed as a troublemaker by men who held her career in their hands. Now she was free to tell the truth. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 3 days, explaining how I'd gathered the evidence, why I'd chosen to record their conversation, what I'd done with the information afterward. The defense attorneys tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the recordings spoke for themselves. Hawthorne received 12 years in federal prison. Webb got 10. The Meridian Foundation was dissolved, its assets distributed to actual educational programs in underserved communities. Meridian Financial Group declared bankruptcy within a month of the arrests, unable to survive the scandal. But the part that satisfied me most came during sentencing. Hawthorne was allowed to make a statement before the judge announced his penalty. He stood behind the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that had replaced his expensive suits, his perfectly styled hair now gray and unkempt, and tried to explain how he'd lost his way, how the pressures of business had led him to make regrettable decisions. He never mentioned my name, never acknowledged that he'd underestimated someone he'd considered beneath notice, never admitted that his downfall had come from treating another human being as invisible. So when the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up in the gallery and made sure everyone in that courtroom knew exactly who I was. I told them about 18 months of emptying his trash, cleaning his messes, being dismissed as furniture in my own workplace. I described the night he fired me, drunk on power and whiskey, convinced that I was too insignificant to matter. I explained how his arrogance had led him to discuss criminal activities in front of someone he considered invisible, how his contempt had made him careless about operational security. I looked directly at him when I spoke, forcing him to see me, to acknowledge my presence, to understand that his downfall had come from someone he'd treated like garbage. His face went pale as he finally comprehended what had happened to him. Not bad luck or poor security or one of the risks of criminal enterprise, but a deliberate and methodical destruction carried out by the invisible man he'd discarded without a second thought. The judge sentenced him to 12 years, noting that financial crimes undermine public trust in institutions and that those in positions of responsibility bore special accountability for their actions. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Hawthorne looked back at me one final time. I met his gaze with the cold satisfaction of a man who'd waited 18 months for that moment. 6 months later, I received a call from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in consulting work, helping them understand how service workers move through corporate environments, what they observe, how they might be better positioned to detect financial fraud in progress. I accepted the position. It turns out that being invisible is a valuable skill when you're hunting criminals who think they're smarter than everyone around them. I still clean buildings sometimes, but now I'm looking for different kinds of messes. The kind that hide in spreadsheets and bank records, that lurk behind expensive suits and corner offices, that thrive in environments where powerful people assume nobody is watching. They're always wrong about that last part, because someone is always watching. Someone is always listening. Someone is always remembering every slight, every insult, every moment of casual cruelty delivered by people who think their position makes them untouchable. Sometimes that someone is invisible until the moment they choose not to be. And when that moment comes, when the recordings start and the evidence mounts and the federal agents arrive with their search warrants and handcuffs, those powerful people learn a lesson they should have absorbed much earlier in their lives. Everyone matters. Everyone has dignity. Everyone deserves respect. And everyone remembers how they've been treated. The smart ones learn this before it's too late. The others end up in orange jumpsuits, wondering how someone they never noticed managed to destroy everything they thought they'd built. I keep Hawthorne's mugshot on my desk now, right next to my FBI credentials. Not out of spite, but as a reminder of what happens when you make the mistake of thinking someone else's humanity is less important than your own convenience. He looks smaller in the photo than he did behind his expensive desk. Diminished, visible in all the wrong ways. Just like he made me feel for 18 months. The difference is, I got to choose when my invisibility ended. He never got to choose when his began.